A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for another webinar. Fantastic to have all of you here, and I know there's been quite of you wanting to ask Q&A, and we'll see if we have time for that. So as we normally do, I'm just gonna go over a quick introduction. Some of you might be new to Strong Support, so you don't know who we are and what we do, and inshallah we can go through that. As we begin, as we always do, we begin with verses of the Quran. I've chosen some verses of Surah Al-Balad to reflect on. This is from verse number 10. وَهَدَيْنَا al-najdain. So we have this concept where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about two ways. We have this common in the Quran between two paths, the path of good or evil, the right hand or the left hand, as it goes later in the verse. So the surah continues, but he has not broken through the difficult paths. فَلَا أَفْتَهُمُ الْأَقَبَةِ. And again, it's beautiful reminder that the path of good is not an easy path. It's not going to be al-aqaba, means something which is steep or something which is an obstacle. So, and then to emphasize what is this aqaba, what is this steep, difficult path, we have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again, the verse, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْأَقَبَةِ. And then we have a series of recommendations of what involves in this right path. Fikku rakaba, freeing of a slave. And of course, at that time, slavery was very prevalent. And you could do that over here. Autama fiyoma fiyomin zi musghaba, feeding on a day of hunger. And subhanAllah, as I was reading these ayahs, and in these days we can only think of Gaza, and we can only think of the people in Gaza. And when I think of that, it kind of minimizes every other thing that we're doing in terms of looking at that injustice. But it's beautiful to see the importance of feeding in the Quran, feeding someone who's hungry. Other verses which talk about yutama ala hubbi ala miskiman wa yatiman wa asira. Other verses which talk about giving food. Again, this is a concept which is in the Quran. Yatiman za mukraba. Again, the concept of giving to an orphan, or miskinan za matraba, or a miskin, somebody who is needy or is in misery. ثم كان من الذين آمنوا وتواصوا بالصبر وتواصوا بالمرحمة. And then be among those who believed and advise one another to patience and advise one another to compassion. And I think very suiting at this time when we are seeing what we're seeing of injustice and zulm in the world. And it is a difficulty for us when we stick to patience and stick to compassion, to know that while we are seeing very scenes of injustice, we know that Allah is the All Just and that there will be justice for what we are seeing today. أولئك أصحاب الميمنة. And that means that our patience and our compassion is definitely under test. So personal reflection for me, anything we can do for people in terms of your voice, in terms of if you know a way to get charity in, anything at the moment. And as we connect with the Quran, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He helps us, guides us the best way that we can as an ummah help people who are oppressed around the world. Um, so those of you who might not know what Strong Support is, we are a peer support organization for Muslims who struggle with sexual or gender identity. We cover quite a broad base. We have support for men and women and also a parent circle. So if you're a parent and you are concerned that your child is um, in the lifestyle um, or questioning, please do support. Come first to support. There is material which is available. Actually, I think there are some parents who are already in this call today who are joining. There's support for you. There's support for a women's circle, which is currently in hiatus, but hope inshallah we will start that soon. We have two men's groups. One I lead on Mondays at 7. Another Brother Muhammad leads at 7:30. Also have one-to-one coaching on Wednesday and Fridays. And then we also have done in the past bespoke training for mosques or other organizations, depending on the need of this topic. And one of the things that we doing now is webinar, which is completely free, open to the public, as a way of putting this topic out so that there's less shame and there's less confusion around this issue. So all of you, well, most of you, if you haven't, please do check out the podcast we were just talking about earlier. Um, I've just taken a snapshot now. I think it's only 2 weeks ago that it's come out and it's had a lot of views. You can see over there, mashallah. And this kind of is a part of the Guardians campaign. So please do check out the Islam UNC Guardians campaign. They're only asking for £10 per month, which is very, very reasonable. There's other topics in there which are controversial topics, which Islam 21C is pioneering, putting work ahead. It's fantastic to see the work which is coming and hitting these topics. So if you did like the podcast and you want to see more of this kind of stuff, please do support Islam 21C and the program and all the great work that they're doing, mashallah. Introduce, we have Ustadh Hamza Andreas Tzortzis. Um, it was actually the first time that I met Brother Hamza. I had not met him before, and I can honestly tell you that he's not like, well, like sometimes you're like, oh my God, this is like a huge person, and he wasn't. He was very calm, down to earth, and very easy to talk to, and you probably saw that in the podcast as well. And we connected after the podcast as well for probably half an hour. So I can tell you that he's completely um, got a kind heart, got a very pure nia and sincere person in what he's doing. And I'm so happy that he's with us. I know he's got a very important commitment just a few minutes after, because we've got the National Dawah Convention, which is happening today in London. So we're very grateful that he's taken the time to be with us. I can't really give credit and do a good bio, but I'm going to attempt anyway here. Brother Hamza is the founder and CEO of Sapience Institute and the leading voice in Islamic thought and philosophy. He authored the best-selling book, which we'll talk a little bit about, The Divine Reality, God, Islam, and the Mirage of Atheism. He also co-authored Unveiling Tyranny, mashallah, exploring narratives around Palestine. He holds advanced degrees in philosophy and Islamic theology and has been working on a PhD on Quranic verses concerning nature. A convert since 2002, he is engaged in high-profile debates with renowned academics and lectured globally. His previous leadership at iERA saw transformative growth and His professional background spans governance, operations, and consultancy. And I can attest to that. I was one of my friends, he said, you do realize we saw Brother Hamza at university? And I said, did we? And then he reminded me he came at our university at Bristol, I think maybe 2010, 2011, something of that time. And he was talking about Quran. And apparently I asked him a question on Quran and science at the time, and he had responded that that was the Dr. Zakir Naik question. I don't actually remember this exchange, but my friend said I did ask him that question at the time. And subhanallah, he's like over, this is 2010, 2011, so you can just imagine the decades of work that he's been involved in. Speaking to him, I know he's passionate about his family. He's passionate about travel, fitness, martial arts, poetry, and mashallah, has done great work on atheism. I think atheism is one of the biggest things which I see in his work with Sapience Institute and um, the book as well. Um, so to find more, hamzattzortzis.com, you can find great articles. There's podcasts, and there's other information which is there. Like I said, the two key things, the book, which is available on Amazon, it's called The Divine Reality, God, Islam, and Atheism. And again, breaks down the concepts of atheism, which I think is so important because when we grow in this world, especially where maybe our past generations, we just thought, well, God exists. We didn't need to ask the question, like, why God? Why is there a God? And I think increasingly now, even if you're a parent, your child might be asking, well, how do we prove? How do we substantially prove that? How do we break it down? It's a fantastic book and endeavor to do that. But not only that, having an institute which answers these questions. A question which was answered, which was called Reclaiming the Rainbow, which is what this webinar is about. Again, one of the resources which is already there. So an institute which looks at this Islamically, makes it available, makes it free, accessible. Amazing, absolutely amazing thing. May Allah bless him for the work that he does and he continues to. Um, Another service which Sapience Institute offers is called Lighthouse Mentoring. And I was amazed to see something like this because there's so many of us which um, come to Islam or have recently converted to Islam, and or we might be in positions of leadership and we're unsure, and mentorship is needed. We talk about mentorship so much at Strong Support in terms of male mentorship, in terms of needing a spiritual mentor, needing a physical education mentor, but also in terms of deen, right? We need a mentor, we need a teacher who talks to us about deen. And I love the concept of mentorship, and I think it's truly Islamic in its when it talks about teaching and helping people out and giving that nasiha, giving that advice. Um, so fantastic project called Lighthouse Mentoring. Please check it out. You can even donate. You can donate to this. It's fantastic. Um, and if you are watching and you are a convert or a Muslim or you're in doubt, then know that the support is available for you. And Allah bless the team, which is obviously behind that and doing that. So for today, again, as I mentioned, Sapience Institute um, will touch upon the um, assumptions of the ideology today, but you can have a deeper dive by going to the website and looking at this article. It's a fantastic article. It's in depth. Like I said, 90 minutes read, but in depth. And I was very I didn't notice. It was after I spoke to Bir Hamza that I'd recognized he had written this, and my uh, honor and respect for him even grew because it was a really great analysis of the common assumptions as we'll go through it, which have become very popular, and which they always state when they try to refute Islamic principles. So that's available. I also caught this is maybe Brother Hamza can talk about this one, but I thought it was good. This is something that we have to put as a disclaimer as well when we do this type of work, which says that the difference between having a different narrative. As Muslims, we don't hate the LGBT, we have a different narrative. Just because I have a different narrative of understanding sexuality doesn't mean I hate your narrative or I hate you as an individual. And I think that's good to call out. And sometimes when I do use the term ideology, sometimes people say, "Isn't that hateful? You're calling LGBTQ ideology." No, because we say Islamic ideology, right? So they're both ideologies. And what we do here is we talk about ideologies. We talk about why we believe in one ideology over the other, but it doesn't mean that we're disrespectful to individuals who may have a different ideology. So I think um, this the points here which talk about that we do not call for violence or discrimination of hatred to any community is fantastic. And I thought it was good that, because sometimes I think when we talk about these things, sometimes they can be misconstrued. So without further ado, I will introduce Ustadh Hamza Tzortzis. Thank you so much for being here. And yes, so you've not been shy of the topic for LGBTQ. I wondered whether they picked you specifically to speak to me because you've not been shy in talking about it in the past.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Jazakallah for having me on. Alhamdulillah.
Um, So you've obviously written this article reclaiming the rainbow. What made you write it in the first instance? What came up for you, or was it just part because you do so much? You look at contemporary issues, things that Muslims are facing, things that people of kind of struggling with their deen are facing. Wondering what the story was before you wrote the article.
I actually don't remember that well, but I kind of reflect on the kind of motivation in a general sense, because with a lot of these things, as you can imagine, you're just thrown into them and you forget how you got into it in the first place. But in general, I've been focusing on theological and philosophical issues for a long time, and I want to articulate a positive case for the Islamic worldview. So because the LGBTQ plus worldview or ideology became, in my view, a little bit aggressive or assertive, especially in schools and in the West, it was pushing a particular narrative. And with that narrative or with those assertions, there was a whole host of assumptions that they weren't really talking about. And the LGBTQ plus ideology or worldview was assuming itself to be universal and absolute. And if you have any disagreement, you're going to be cancelled. There's going to be no debate or discussion. You're going to be sidelined. You're going to be seen as someone that's immoral and backwards. And I felt that was really, really unfair. And I wanted to present my views on this, which I felt that with any worldview, you have a whole host of assumptions. With any worldview, you have a whole host of philosophical premises, if you like. For example, even secularism itself has a whole host of assumptions. It assumes that, religion and politics have to be separate. They have to have the kind of, distinct domains, and they cannot, you know, overlap. But that's an assumption. And, you could use philosophical language. You could say that secularism has its own epistemological, which really means the study of knowledge, and metaphysical biases. Yeah. And it assumes that God and religion are unable to govern societies, right? Especially in those societies, if there are groups within those societies that have competing religious worldviews. That's an assumption, right? And it also has an assumption that religion in general is kind of impotent in addressing these political problems or these problems that may arise, especially when you have conflicting groups within a particular society. And that assumption came from a historical exercise, really. It was a very Eurocentric exercise where, the Catholic Church used the coercive arm of the state, and it was trying to, force its doctrines onto people, or at least it was not allowing any doctrines that were incongruent with its worldview. So,
Mm.
secularism has this assumption. It says church and state must be separate, for example. But we're not under any moral or intellectual obligation to accept such an assumption. So, and that's, one small example. There are many examples that you can use. And what I would say is, I started to think about, well, what are the assumptions of the LGBTQ plus worldview? And I was like, you know what? There are quite a few. And you know what? They don't align with Islam. And you know what? Many of them are incoherent. So how can they force this down people's throats? How can they assume it's absolute and universal? And I felt that was really unfair. It was intellectually unfair because they have this kind of almost intellectual hegemony going on, right? Especially in certain parts of the West. And I felt this is not right. But in reacting that way, I also have to understand that human beings are emotional, human beings are psychological, and that's why in the piece I spend some time in talking about, well, let's chill. Let's understand that these are human beings. All human beings have spiritual needs, psychological needs, intellectual needs. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us in Surah Mumtahana that, He does not forbid us to be kind and just with those who do not fight us for our religion and do not expel us from our homes. Now, what's very interesting here is, as long as someone's not physically fighting you, and as long as no one's expelling you from your home, then you have to have a sense of deep and profound goodness for them. In actual fact, the word that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses is a similar word on how He tells us to, treat our parents, this idea of bir, right?
Mm.
To have this piety. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us to be just and pious and good with people. So, and that includes people from the LGBTQ plus community. And that's very important to understand. Also, the Prophet ﷺ said in hadith that's narrated in Tarikh al-Kabir, narrated by Bukhari, and there are many ulama who talk about this as well from different traditions, to love for linnas, love for humanity, what you love for yourself, love for the people, what you love for yourself. And this is important. And, from a Quranic perspective, when Allah uses, all people, this also refers to non-Muslims, of course. And, loving for others what you love for yourself in the Islamic tradition means that you're committed to the well-being, to the goodness and guidance of all people. And this is even explained by, for example, the scholar Ibn Taqiq al-Eid, and also An-Nawawi as well, the famous scholar An-Nawawi, when he comments on a very similar hadith that talks about love for your brother, what you love for yourself. It's the 13th hadith in his collection of the Arba'in, of the 40 hadith. And he says that, yes, it means brotherhood in terms of religious brotherhood, Muslim brotherhood, but he also says it means humanity, because he says that, but in what way? Because you need to be committed to the goodness and the guidance. And really, if you define what essential part of love, or at least a form of love, is to be committed to the goodness and guidance of all people. That's what rahmah is, loving mercy. That's what, love is, especially in the English language, that you're committed to the goodness and the guidance of all people. You stand for them. Just Eric Fromm, the psychoanalyst, in his book, The Art of Loving, he talks about that you stand for people, not falling in. A love is not a falling in, it's a standing for, yeah? And also, I think the Christian scholar M. Scott Peck, he also mentions this in his very famous book, best-selling book, that love is you standing for someone. So I'm standing for you, meaning it's intentional, it's directional. I want goodness for you and guidance for you. So that is an important caveat when we
Mm,
discuss these issues, because they're very controversial. Because sometimes, especially
yeah.
me, I could be a bit assertive in my philosophical and theological stances, and I may come across passionate. People thinking, "Hey, this guy is attacking us." No, I'm not. I'm just dealing with the ideas. You don't have to agree with me, but
Yeah.
these ideas come from a good space that I'm committed to your goodness and your guidance.
And this point, what you've just mentioned, is so important because it puts the universality of human rights, in Islam, where it doesn't say I treat you differently because you're different, but it looks at the inherent goodness of that person. In that in Islam we have the concept of everyone is inherently good in the sense that that we choose to look at the goodness of what this person is, what is in common, what we share, and again, having, even if we have a different narrative, we're not going to deny the inherent humanity of that individual. And so when it comes to this paradigm, the Western paradigm, which seeks to divide people, gives labels or says, no, they're different, or this assumption which you tackle, which says, no, these people are born this way, or they're inherently different. Islam is actually coming in and saying, well, we Allah created them. Even if you hold on to the notion that they're born this way, then don't we think that the creator would know what he had created,
Mm.
and would the creator be not understand something which is happening to his creation? So I think what you're talking about in the universality of brotherhood, that includes everyone. It just doesn't include Muslims, as you said, and includes humanity as its whole. And that's why Islam is a very inclusive religion, because it allows everyone to come as they are, and that the journey towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a journey, and that no one can expect that people would be able to um, have full submission on day one, but that it is a journey. And that's why sometimes the Quran refers to Ya ayyuhan nas, and sometimes it refers to Ya ayyuhal mu'minun, because there is guidance which is in there for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously, we have a specific definition of what you would call the kind of brotherhood in faith, Islamic brotherhood. But Islam also understands that there is a human family and that human beings deserve dignity, and that the way we relate to them has to be, by default, has to be one of rahmah. And the Prophet ﷺ was a mercy to the worlds, to everyone, Muslims and non-Muslims. And even though the rahmah itself, mercy, I don't think captures it. I think loving mercy, especially in the English language context, is a better way of putting it. Because rahmah, as Allah, when He talks about His name, Ar-Rahman, He said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Hadith Qudsi that He named the womb after His name, right? The root, Rahamim.
Mm.
And that's not haphazard. And when you think about the idea of the womb, it's not just mercy, it's a loving mercy, because a mother loves the child before the child is born. Yes, the mother has this kind of power dynamic that the baby is dependent on her for sure, but it's more than that. She has this care and affection, it's intentional and directional, it's loving. Rahma cannot be captured with the word mercy, in my view. But yeah, we should have this loving mercy for all people. And that means essentially being committed to the goodness and the guidance. Now, you mentioned about, the whole thing of identity. Maybe we could unpack some of the assumptions now. So
Hmm.
maybe we could start with this one. So, you know, obviously people could read the essay to go into a deep dive, but I think it's important just to unpack some of these assumptions of the LGBTQ plus movement. Now, what we need to understand first and foremost is like, what does the ideology maintain? What does it really say? So in general, it basically says same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity is not immoral and it's a right. Yeah. And then you could frame that in different ways, but essentially, you could break it down to that. And that claim itself has some assumptions, and not all of these assumptions are adopted by all of the advocates of the LGBTQ plus ideology. And some of these assumptions may even contradict uh, other assumptions, but that's not the point here. The point is, these are the key assumptions of the LGBTQ plus community, or at least not the community, but the ideology, because there are people who kind of have an affiliation with the community, but they disagree with the ideology. And that's very important to understand because sometimes people don't understand that, but it's actually true. And we could unpack that further. So there are a few assumptions, and the five key assumptions are number one, that human beings, sorry, possess their own bodies. They have this thing called like radical autonomy, if you like, yeah. And therefore, if I own and possess my own self, my own physicality, my own biology, my own body, then I could do whatever I want, right? uh, Within certain legal parameters, of course. Number two, the other assumption is that same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity are lifestyle choices that are strictly individual matters. Therefore, they could do whatever they want. It's an individual right, yeah. So it's an individual matter. Uh, Same-sex intercourse, gender fluidity, the lifestyle choices, and you have your own liberty and freedom to actually choose whether you want to exercise that right or not. Number three, the third assumption is, well, there are no sound moral objections to same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity. Where are they? According to Western normative ethics like utilitarianism or deontological ethics, which we don't have to unpack too much, but basically utilitarianism says that it's a consequentialist moral theory that it focuses on the consequences of a particular action. And it says that if you could increase the well-being of happiness for the greater number of people, then that's good. If you could decrease the suffering for the greater number of people, that's also good. But if you increase the suffering, that's bad. That's evil. Now, obviously, there are various problems with that, because then you have to define, well, what do you mean by suffering and well-being and happiness? And is it just dunya happiness? Why are you ignoring the akhirah? So it's a very secular normative theory. Who defines happiness and well-being and suffering and all that stuff. But the point is, they will use that secular normative ethical framework to actually pass judgments. And what's very interesting historically, from what I remember, the utilitarian thinkers in the past would use that framework, that normative ethical theory, to try and show that homosexuality is immoral. Now they're using it to show that it's okay, right? So look, the point is that they're saying there are no sound moral objections. When we look into secular normative ethical theories like deontological ethics or utilitarianism, there's no objections. Therefore, leave people alone. The fourth assumption is that sexuality and desires are identity shaping features. So, say I have a sexual desire, I have same sex attraction. Well, that forms who you are, right? And that is, in my view, one of the most troubling assumptions because it's not necessarily true in any shape or form. And you echoed this earlier that Islam elevates the human being to rise above their desires and actually to identify with their fitrah, with the innate nature which that Allah created us to be upon, which is that we're here to have a higher purpose, something more meaningful, to humbly adore the divine, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one who created us, the one who nurtures us, the one who's worthy of worship, that we're here to humbly adore him, to submit to him, to love him. That's our purpose, to be worshippers, to be at service to the divine. not at service to our desires or submitting to our desires or being subjugated by our own selves. Interestingly, Allah even says, have you not seen the one who takes his own desire as his Lord? And we would unpack that a little bit further. So, also, you have the fifth assumption, which is gender and sexuality are social constructs which have no fixed or innate essence. And that's more of the kind of the T and the Q part of the LGBTQ plus ideology. And that one is extremely problematic, which we'll unpack in a few moments. So, I mean, look, you could read the essays well referenced, and you could go into do a deeper dive. But let's unpack some of these assumptions. So, the first thing is that the first assumption is, well, human beings possess their own bodies. They could do whatever they want with them. Yeah. Now that is a kind of radical autonomy. Yeah. That's basically saying I am me, and part of me is my body, and I possess my body, and I own my body, and therefore I can do whatever I want as long as it doesn't harm anyone, or as long as it's within the law, and as long as it doesn't harm anyone, and that harm is understood from the perspective of the liberal harm principle, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But the point here is, we don't have to accept that, because we have a different worldview. We have a different ontology, meaning the source of nature reality is that God created uh, the world and reality. And God created our bodies. He created us. And Allah is the Rabb, the Lord, and the owner and the maintainer and sustainer of everything that exists. He is Al-Khaliq, the creator, Al-Khalaq, the perpetually creating. So a part of our understanding of Tawheed, the oneness of the divine, the unicity of the divine and the transcendence of the divine, is that He owns us fundamentally, right? So if Allah owns us, then He has the right to tell us what to do, because He owns our bodies, right? I can't, you know, I don't have that fundamental right, if you like, to say, well, I could do whatever I want. No, you do what Allah wants because He owns you, right? Now, that doesn't mean we don't have what you would call agency. Of course, we have agency. We have free will to do bad things with our bodies or good things with our bodies. I could clench my fist and punch someone, or I can open my hand and give someone charity, for sure. That's my own free will. But that's agency. That's nothing to do with the whole thing, autonomy. Allah owns us, right? And He's given us the free will to choose whether to submit to His divine commands or not. And but the point here is, we can't now turn back to Allah and say, no, this is my body, so I could do whatever I want, right? That argument just doesn't work at all in any shape or form, because it's Allah that actually owns our bodies, right?
Even in a state has rules, right? So, for example, a state will say you can't vote until you're 18, or you can't do this thing until that. And what's we find crazy with this ideology is that people can take hormone inducing pills which change their body, or can have these, kind of crazy, irreversible damage done to your body. And the state allows that before 18, but things like voting, you can't, right? So there's exactly this concept which says, let me do whatever I want, because going back to that thing of, because I get to do, it's me, it's my body, and how you've just put that Islam has that balance between, well, this body is gifted to you, but Allah has given you free will. So yes, there's a view of agency, but there's also a responsibility that you have with
Mm,
that body, as you're saying. And this concept of let me do what I want, which is satanic in a sense. If you look at Satanism, that's kind of do what Aleister Crowley says, do what thou wilt, right? Is Goes against the sacredness of what the body is and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us khilafa over, in a sense. Or yeah, so it's interesting when it comes to law. The law is very lenient to things like trans surgeries before 18. I mean, they're getting better now, but it confirms your ideology number one, which says, let me do what I want with my body.
Yeah, because they believe in that radical autonomy. But you raise an interesting point that our bodies are a trust and a manner. And with that amana comes a responsibility. And a key responsibility is to actually acknowledge that your body belongs to Allah and that Allah has a right to tell you what to do with it. And not only that, we'll unpack this further in the other assumptions that Allah, when He commands us, is actually good for our bodies and it's good for our souls. And it's not just, good in a dunya sense, it's good in the akhirah sense as well. So that would be the first assumption. It's an important assumption. People may think it's obvious, but it actually kind of translates into other um, discourses, if you like. For example, you know, consider the kind of secular liberal notion of abortion, right? In the UK recently, they just made a law that up to the ninth month you could have an abortion, right? Which, with all due respect, under any conception of Islamic law, that's murder, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so, now the reason they adopt that view is because they adopt, again, the same position, the same assumption, because that assumption was not unique to the LGBTQ plus ideology. It also belongs to liberal feminism as well. Like liberal feminists would say that my body, my choice. And unfortunately, some Muslims adopt that silly narrative as well because they don't understand the Islamic worldview properly and just say, we just have to be authentic with people. We actually don't believe it's my body, therefore it's not my choice. Yeah. Yes, I have a choice whether to obey Allah or not, but fundamentally, this I have to submit to Allah because He knows me better than I know myself. And Allah created my body in the first place. He has every right to tell me what to do with my body. Now, obviously, the LGBTQ plus advocates and the liberal feminists will say, well, we don't believe in Allah. We don't believe what He said. Well, that's exactly where we want them. This is what we want to discuss. This is the whole, understand our position, understand our worldview, right? And at least be humble enough to understand that you have assumptions that you cannot prove. You're just making them up based on your own liberal assumptions and your own secular worldview. But at least admit it. Admit that you have your own presuppositions and admit you have your own assumptions. And if you're in that position, then at least it should humble you. You should be willing to listen to us or at least stand in the possibility that your assumptions may be completely wrong. And that's where we want them, you see. We want to have that discussion about worldview, ontology, the basis of our deen, because we believe we have the truth and we could articulate it. And that's why sometimes people fail in this discourse when Muslims, when they're talking about this to liberals or feminists or the LGBTQ plus community, is because we don't bring it to the foundations. We actually adopt some of the assumptions sometimes. You may have a sister in America having a placard saying, my body, my choice. I'm like, are you for real? Like, do you even understand what that means according to the Islamic worldview? So that's very, very important to add. So the second assumption is interesting as well because it basically says that you know it's an individual right. Okay, so same-sex intercourse, gender fluidity is an individual right. As long as it's within the law, it's an individual right. And basically, what they argue is that you have the individual right to love anyone you want in any way that you want and to express that love in any way, irrespective of their gender. And they also assert that identifying as any gender, irrespective of biological, by the way, biological and cultural markers, and transitioning into any gender is a moral and legal entitlement. Yeah. Now, this assumption is a kind of liberal assumption, if you like. The reason I'm saying this is because under the liberal conception of rights, the primacy, meaning the kind of priority is on the individual, right? So what the individual wants, what the individual's interests um, cannot be constrained by society or any external force. And that is basically individualism or atomism, as I don't usually like quoting feminist philosophers, but as the feminist philosopher Marilyn Friedman said, that individualism is seeing the individual as an abstract entity divorced from social obligations and attachments. The philosopher Professor Charles Taylor, he says primacy is on the individual as an atomistic thing, not connected to society in that way. So when it comes to rights, it's like, well, my interests, my desires, my rights should not be constrained by any external force, social or otherwise. Yeah. Now, we would argue, well, okay, we understand your assumption, but this is an assumption, and it assumes a secular or liberal conception of rights. We are under no moral or ethical or intellectual obligation or epistemic obligation to accept your conception of rights. Yeah, there may be some overlaps, but you have your own conception of rights. And so do we. For example, in the Islamic tradition, it's called hukuk al-ibad, the rights of the worldly servants. And that's based on Allah's commands and the divine command framework and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And Allah is the one who has a right to give us our rights, yeah, because He created us. And that has obviously ontological commitments, meaning that we believe that the source and nature of reality is actually Allah. He created the heavens and the earth. And He also assumes that He sent down revelation, which is the Quran. But those assumptions can be proven in our tradition. And that shifts the discussion away from talking about rights to more fundamental worldview realities. But we're not here to discuss those things. But the point is, we don't have to adopt that conception of rights because we have our own conception of rights, and it's not based on an individualistic assumption or the primacy of the individual. In actual fact, if you were to look at Islamic rights concerning individuals, there's a careful interplay and a balance between social obligations and individual obligations, social duties, individual duties, social rights, individual rights, and this very, interesting complementarian model going on. And that's why I wouldn't say we're communitarian per se, because that's its own secular worldview, but we have aspects of communitarianism, meaning we believe in the social, we believe that a society is not just a collection of individuals. And we know this from that famous hadith of Prophet ﷺ, when he talks about, the rights or the limits or the rights of Allah, the hudud, are like people on a boat. You have an upper deck and a lower deck, right? And the upper deck are giving fresh water to the people on the lower deck. But if the upper deck stop giving water, the lower deck start making a hole in the ground or in the boat, and then whole boat sinks. So the whole society sinks, right? So there's that balance between individuals, society, and individuals. There's more to unpack there, but it's just a quick understanding to show that we don't have a liberal conception of rights, or a secular one at least. We believe in Allah, we believe in a message, right? And we don't
Absolutely.
believe in the primacy of the individual from a liberal conception. So what we would say is that Allah has the right to give us our rights because Allah created us, and Allah is Al-Hakim. He is the wise. He is Al-Alim, the knowing. Allah has the totality of knowledge and wisdom. He has the picture. We just got the pixel. Allah is Al-Bar. He's the source of all goodness. So His commands are a derivative of His nature in a way, and that they're going to be based on that goodness and that divine knowledge and that divine wisdom.
And on a very practical scale, Hukuk al-Ibad teaches society that uh, people have a right over you, right? So neighbors, nobody thinks about neighbors. Quran talks about the right of your neighbor, and how big is the neighbor in Islamically? It's
Yes.
huge. How it's considered. So when we think, as you said, Islam thinks collectively, it will not think individualistically as the individualism does. It puts to you that actually, yes, there might be some things that you make individual decisions for, and there is agency, like what you described in free will. But ultimately, when we look at a macro level, then a lot or some of your decisions will have an impact on other people, and especially in terms of relationships. Um, if relationships in an Islamic sense only are talked in the conception of a family, right? And in a family, you think about children. So it's interesting when they talk about adults talk about desires, they only talk about it from an adult sense. And they don't talk about their desires from a child sense as to what effects those things would have if you're going to have a relationship, then maybe you're going to have children, right? And one day, if you're going to have children, your individual rights are going to affect those children in that relationship, or it might affect the society around you. And it's a very microscopic, like you said, a very microscopic view of the way of saying we're a collection of individuals rather than we are a society or we're a family unit or we're a group or we're groups of groups rather than just focusing on one person. Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. That was very well articulately. Very you expressed that in an articulate way. Jazakallah. So absolutely. And this really leads to the third assumption, right? Which is there's no sound moral objections. So what the LGBTQ plus ideology basically says that look, same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity do not have any wrong-making features, right? And you have that in the language of philosophy. You have more philosophers writing books on these issues, and they basically say that there are no wrong-making features concerning same-sex intercourse or gender fluidity. And so they claim, therefore, there's nothing wrong about same-sex intercourse and nothing wrong about gender fluidity, because it doesn't inflict significant harm on anyone. It doesn't violate anyone's autonomy. It's not necessarily unfair, and it doesn't violate anyone's individual rights. Therefore, how can it be morally wrong? Now, this is interesting because this assumes a specific moral position or an ethical theory. It assumes at least two of the major secular normative ethical theories known as utilitarianism or deontological ethics. And we don't have to go into that and unpack them a lot. You could read the essay and do your further reading. But utilitarianism is basically a consequentialist theory. It focuses on the consequences, and it's a rational normative theory because they it's secular, meaning they use their minds. They don't think about God. They use their minds, and they say using your sound rational faculties or your rational faculties, you could come up with an understanding of the consequences of a particular action. And they develop, for example, particular principles. And you could trace utilitarianism to the 19th century British philosophers such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and they developed something called the greatest happiness principle. And so what it does, it identifies immorality as producing more pain or ill-being than happiness, yeah? And therefore it identifies morality with producing more pleasure or more happiness than ill-being, than suffering, right? For the greatest number of people. That's very important because if it's just individuals for your own an individual, that's called ethical egoism, which is something else. But generally speaking, utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory that says, look, we follow the greatest happiness principle. If you increase the well-being and happiness for the greatest number of people, then that is good. If you decrease suffering for the greatest number of people, that's also good. If you increase suffering, that's bad, that's evil. And before we unpack it, the other ethical theory that I mentioned was deontological ethics. Now, deontological ethics is not a consequentialist theory, although there are some nuances, but we don't have to discuss those. But it doesn't really focus on the consequences. It basically says that the moral worth of an action is not the consequences, is if it's in line with certain you know ethical principles, or they develop certain rational criteria that they put into place in order to understand whether a moral act is good or evil, right or wrong,
Mhm.
bad or good. And that those criterion come from their own intellects, right? And historically you could link deontological ethics to the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And so Immanuel Kant would basically, you heard he had the categorical principle as well, which we could talk about another time. But deontological ethics essentially is basically developing rational criteria to find out about the moral worth of an action. Um, uh, 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 and it doesn't focus on the consequences. And that's why you would see deontological ethics being described as a duty-based ethic, that we are duty bound. Like one would argue, for example, the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade in America, according to utilitarianism, was actually ethical. It was good because it increased the economic well-being, increase and therefore the happiness for the greatest number of people. They would say, who cares about these minority blacks? We could enslave them because by enslaving them, you have a greater happiness, right? So some utilitarian thinkers may
Mm.
argue, or especially at that time, they'd be like, you know what? Uh, According to our greatest happiness principle, if you look at America, especially look at the South of America, the Southerners were having a great time at the expense of a minority black people. But this
Mm.
is it's the greatest happiness principle. It's increasing the great happiness for the greatest number of people. And that's why in the West, generally speaking, they would adopt utilitarianism and deontological ethics as a combination of both. So the deontological ethicists would basically say, no, we don't care about the consequences. We don't care about economic prosperity and you being more happy because what you're doing, you're violating some morals, and the worth of those morals is not based on the consequences. It's based on these certain criteria that we developed, and because we are duty bound not to enslave other human beings, we are duty bound not to discriminate other people based on their color of their skin, irrespective of the consequences. Even if in hypothetical situations it was increasing the well-being of a society by being racist and enslaving people, it's still wrong because we don't follow uh, the consequences because they're in deontological ethicists. They follow that they are duty bound. There are rational criteria that are developed to find out whether something is good or bad, irrespective of the consequences. Now, if you want to get deeper, there are different type of deontological theories: agent-centered, patient-centered, contractualist deontological theories. The point is, uh, deontological ethicists say that moral agents have to honor certain moral obligations, irrespective of any consequence or outcome. Now, what we would say as Muslims, well, we don't accept any of them, really. Fundamentally, we're divine command theorists. We don't look at the consequences, especially from a secular lens, because even if we do look at the consequences, because in Islamic legal moral theory, you have this idea of the maslahah and mafsada, the benefit and the harm, right? Or the masalih and the mafasid, the benefits and the harms. That is considered, but within a divine command framework. But the point is, even when we consider the consequences, it's within a divine command framework, and it actually considers the harms and the benefits not only from a dunya perspective, an akhirah perspective as well. And that's why we would reject them, the utilitarianism, the consequentialist theory, because it's very secular. They don't consider the akhirah happiness or the akhirah harm, Jannah and Jahannam,
Mm.
all of these things. So we're divine command theorists. We believe in the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't have to, develop a thesis now to defend it. But essentially, when you look at the nature of the divine, Allah is Al-Barr, He's the source of all goodness. He has the totality of knowledge and wisdom. Allah is Al-Hakim, Al-Alim. He's the knowing, he's the wise. He has the picture, we got the pixel. He has the moral picture, we've got the moral pixel. Allah knows the past, present, future. He knows all of the consequences. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not of in this universe and dunya. Allah is transcendent. Laysa kamithlihi shay. Therefore, he
Mm.
can make inverted commas the external moral claim, and
Mm.
universal moral claim as well. And it's not subjective because Allah has all knowledge. It's because something being subjective is subject to a limitation. Allah is not subject to any limitation, meaning
Mm.
that there's nothing external to him that limits him. He is perfect. He's maximally perfect with his names and attributes are to the highest degree possible without any deficiency, without any flaw. So when Allah makes a command, it's good, right?
Yeah.
So
It, it 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 reminds me also of if I'm living a life according to my values, my value system, and utilitarianism says I need to be happy. Well, sometimes I'm not happy in things which aren't going my way. So, for example, if I speak about Palestine, I'm not going to be happy because my job's going to be taken away or something's going to be taken away. But I don't care because I care about my value and I'm going to speak out against it anyway. So then it breaks that concept where you can live a life which is of your values and true, may not give you happiness, but you know that you're living a true life or you're fighting for what is true. Whereas the utilitarian argument would say, that's not your, why are you talking about Palestine? It has nothing to do with your home or your career or what you're doing. Be happy, seek your happiness. And this concept, what you mentioned with the ayah before, have you seen the one who takes God as his desire? The desire to be happy is a desire, so um, sometimes a lot of us do things which don't make us happy, but we do it because of a long-term objective, like you say, akhirah, or something where we have value-based living, where we say this thing isn't true, or I want to this whatever is falsehood is being spread, so I need to speak out against the falsehood, and that speaking out against falsehood isn't necessarily going to bring you happiness, but it's something that you have to do for the long term. Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, it gets more kind of philosophical, deeper with different uh, normative ethical theories, like the utilitarian thinkers would basically say that they have a hierarchy of values concerning,
Mm.
you know, you know, you could be like a pig, right? And they even mentioned this in literature that you could be a satisfied pig, literally rolling in the mud and satisfying your bestial desires. And they were like, well, that according to utilitarian thinking, well, that means it's the most moral thing to do. But they say no, there are levels to the kind of happiness game or well-being game, and they would create a hierarchy of
Mm.
of what one ought to pursue, if you like. Like, I think there was a famous statement. It's been a while since I've read around it, but it was something like, I'd rather be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig or something. And and that argument and that argument is an argument to challenge this idea that is it just about a base level of satisfaction and happiness and well-being, or are there levels to the game? But then they would people who object to utilitarianism would argue, well, doesn't that now mean that there is something external to the happiness principle that you require in order to, create
Mm.
different hierarchies or value systems concerning,
Yes, the sun.
but yeah, do you see
Mhm.
your point? And that's one of the challenges against utilitarianism. But what we would say is this: we would say, look, we want to be happy in the akhirah. That's the greatest happiness. Yeah. Now they
Mm.
won't accept that because it's a secular normative ethical theory. That's why we can't call ourselves utilitarian thinkers or ethicists, because it's secular. They don't believe in the akhirah. Yeah. So that's one thing we would reject, and that has an ontological commitment. We believe in Allah and in the messengers and the akhirah and the Quran. Um, and the other thing would be is, well, what do you define as well-being? Yeah, what is truly well-being? And if you're gonna create is a value structure of different types of well-being, who's gonna do that? Yeah,
Yeah,
we say
yeah.
Allah. So even if you talk about the nuances, we all have our own position because we have our own worldview. And even with the whole deontological ethics, we would say, well, we reject your criterion that you put in place to think that this is something that you ought to do irrespective of the consequences. We're saying no, you should follow Allah's command, and because of the reason I've just mentioned previously, right? Um, and also when there is a kind of conflict between two uh, moral duties, which one takes priority of the other one? Who's going to prioritize that? Your own life?
Understand.
You say, no, we believe in Allah. Allah's going to do that for us because Allah is the all-knowing, all-wise. He's the transcendent, and we're just nothing compared to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no comparison. So moving on, there's the fourth assumption is the identity shaping features, which is very interesting because the whole ideology wants you to identify with your desires, whether it's same-sex desires or any other type of desires, right? Interestingly, Ellen D.B. Riggle and Sharon S. Rotosky They articulated this argument in their work, A Positive View of LGBTQ. And they said, claiming our LGBT identities is an act of self-empowerment and may enhance our sense of well-being. Living our life authentically, even though it may feel risky at times, facilitates personal growth. Coming to love and appreciate ourselves for who we are frees up our energy to pursue goals and activities that are meaningful to us. So, what they're basically arguing is that one's sexual desires shape your identity and your sense of self as a human being. And without freely exploring this, and the themes of sexuality and gender, a person would be deprived of a crucial element of the authenticity in their life. So they're basically restricting. They argue that restricting these desires and from these desires from being freely expressed, especially their sexuality and gender identity, they say it could result in psychological harm and hinder personal development. Now, um, the, so yeah, so this advocates for people to have autonomy to determine their authentic identity and pursue the sexuality without any societal repression or constraints. But what we would say is, well, that's not necessarily true. We don't reduce the human being to to our desires. There is no necessary link between one's desires and one's identity, because if you want to go down that route, it will open Pandora's box. Yeah, because what else are you going to start identifying with
Mm.
in regards to your desires? What Allah Subhanahu wa Taala teaches us, especially from a Quranic and prophetic perspective, is that we have the lower self, the bestial aspects of the ruh, of the soul, but there are
Mm.
higher levels of the soul. Allah is
Mm.
teaching us not to reduce ourselves to the low self, to the lowly self,
نفس
but
الأمر. Mhm.
absolutely, we should elevate ourselves. And the way to do that is by following Allah's commands, by having a relation with Allah to transcend the nafs and the ego, and also to understand that Allah has dignified us. He's dignified the son of Adam, and he's giving us a meaningful purpose that transcends the bestial aspects of who we are. In actual fact, I would even say the LGBTQ plus ideology wants to reduce the human being like an animal, because that's what animals do, really. They identify themselves to their desires. Yeah. And now, how far are you going to go with that? So what Islam does, it has an elevated picture, a meaningful, deep, elevated picture, if you like, or presentation of what the human being should be pursuing. Should be pursuing a path of meaning, of purpose, and the greatest purpose is to be a servant to the divine, a servant to
Mm.
Allah, one that worships, submits, loves, humbly adores Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and one that basically does not submit themselves to their own desires. And they don't worship their desires, they worship Allah. And as we mentioned the verse, Allah says in the Quran, have you not seen the one who takes his own desires as his Lord? And we're saying no. We're saying there's something more than that. Human beings are bigger than that. You have a higher
Mm.
purpose, an absolute purpose that has come from Allah, your creator. It's a higher purpose. Allah wants you to be dignified. Allah doesn't want you to reduce yourself to the lowly aspects of yourself, to the
Mm.
animal aspects, the bestial aspects. Transcend that. You're different from an animal. You're a human being, not a human doing. Yeah, your way of being, yeah, is grounded in this ultimate purpose of submitting and loving the one that created you. And that's what Allah is telling us to do. And Allah says also in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about, which is a very powerful ayah actually, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about that, the one who follows their desires, they're the ones who are like, gone astray, right?
Mhm.
Allah doesn't want us to be straight. Allah wants us to be guided. Allah wants us to um be on the straight path. So in so many places in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala senses the idea that you're just going to follow your desires. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's
And
frowned upon, and it's looked at something that is not befitting of the divine purpose that has been given to the human being.
yeah. And a common misconception with people who are, kind of saying, or they're saying Islam is anti-LGBT, anti this reality, it doesn't deny it. It's actually saying, no, Islam is inclusive. So it's not, when we mention nafs al-amara, it is addressing, yes, there is a part of you which has the sexual desire. We're not hiding it. We're not saying it's not there. We're not denying it. We're not repressing it. We're saying it's there, but we're saying it's a part of you. So we'll have nafs al-mutma'inna, we have other states. So as a human being, we're not just one state. And this is the beautiful concept of nafs, is nafs being not just one thing, but being a collection of different things. And there's a complexity which is within our nafs. So when they they say, "Oh, I'm gay" or "I'm straight" or these labels, they're very reductive because they're reducing yourself to a desire. Whereas while Islam acknowledges that that desire does exist or different desires do exist, it says you're not just that desire, but there's more parts of you. Of course, there's a part of you which has a sexual attraction, but that's not the only part of you. There's other
Yeah.
parts of you which are there. So just because society has discriminated or um, divided people who have same-sex attraction, I don't need to divide myself because society has divided them. So it's Islam's actually inclusive because it's saying it's not denying the attraction or it's not denying that that exists, but it is giving you a template which is says I don't need to identify with this or I don't need a sexual identity because it doesn't help me. A lot of people come to me and they say, Ali, do I need to be straight to get married? Well, they say no, it isn't that you need to come to the identity. Allah already recognizes that you have the attraction, but it doesn't mean that I need to, you know, come to an identity, then I come to Allah. No, Allah accepts you as what we were saying with the first argument. Allah accepts you as you are. There's that universality that Allah accepts you, and it's just trying to reframe, and that's all it is, right? It's a reframing at the issue. It's not denying that something exists. And I think a lot of the times people get confused because they say, no, you deny the reality that they exist. We're saying we're not denying the reality, but we're reframing it that it isn't the it isn't the thing, like just because you like what you said earlier, just because you like chocolate and I like chocolate, I don't think we need to create, like people who like black chocolate versus white chocolate, right? We don't need to create an identity for each one of our desires. Of course, chocolate eating isn't as scandalous as sexual affairs, but it's the same concept in terms of people have chosen a label over um, uh, being a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. And look, and consider the fitrah. Allah says in
Mm.
chapter 30, verse 3 that to adhere to the natural way that Allah has created all human beings. And embedded
فطرة
within that
mhm,
fitrah is the
mhm,
affinity to worship Allah. And Allah, and I mentioned this earlier, that when Allah talks about following your desires in chapter 28, verse 50, Allah says, "Who is more astray than the one who follows his desire without guidance from Allah? Indeed,
mhm,
Allah does not guide the wrongdoing people." And Allah talks about that this is the natural way of Allah. Who is better than Allah in ordaining a way? Um, so this is something that's important because based on the hadith in Sahih Muslim where the Prophet said that every child is born in the state of fitrah, and then it's his parents that make him into a Jew, Christian, or Magian. So this is an idea in our theology that there is a natural that Allah created something within us that is unchanging, that is a natural affinity to acknowledge Allah, to worship Him, and many ulama, many scholars says to affirm many of these objective moral truths that you could find in the Quran and the prophetic teachings. So this is what we will say, fine, you may have these desires, but who you really are is embedded in your fitrah, that you're here to be elevated, to not submit to your desires, to submit to Allah, not to love your desires, to love Allah, not to worship your desires, but to worship Allah. And any of the desires that are good and you could express them within the Islamic moral framework, then you do that. And any of the desires that are blameworthy, then you work on yourself. You have a taqwa centric, God conscious centric, or an Allah centric methodology and approach that you could find in our tradition that can deal with these blameworthy desires. And it's not just sexuality. There are certain heterosexual men that want to get married more than 4 times, but they can't. Sorry, there's a limit. It's 4, for example, yeah? Or there are some people who may have anger issues where they're going to start now identifying with their anger and then creating this, social construct called, I don't know, the anger crew. I don't know, whatever. I don't know, whatever you want to call
Yes.
it. Or there's so many different things that you could say, well, why identify with this desire and not the other one? It shows that that they already have made up their mind about certain things, in terms of which desires they should pursue or not, which is based on their own worldview, and we could categorically reject it. We say no, you are how you were created. You are this natural, you're born in this pure state, which is an affinity for Allah, an affinity to worship Him, to serve Him, to submit to Him, not to submit to your desires. And any desires that you do have, if they're within the Islamic framework, you could express them, no problem. Yeah. Any ones that are blameworthy, then you basically deal with them appropriately. Um, and this idea they don't reject anyway. I know it's changing now, unfortunately, but take for example this whole idea of men, and many men in the West, they have what they would call pedophilic kind of desires, that they have a desire to have intercourse with very young boys or girls, like 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old. Now, they say, no, that's wrong. Okay, we agree. Yeah. But that's a desire too. They could use, and they are
Mm.
actually using the same arguments now. There are movements. I don't know if you've seen this.
Yeah.
They're they're not calling these people pedophiles anymore. Calling them things like
Minor
basically
attracted persons
minor
and
attracted persons, right?
yeah,
Which is
yeah.
insane. And then they're going to be using the same arguments. They're saying, well, it's a desire and you should identify with your desire. And, maybe let's, change our ideas about consent, because they already changed it with the transgender movement about consent. Because someone who
Mhm.
hasn't reached puberty, they could even, mutilate their bodies. Yeah. Right. They call it gender affirming care, where they could cut pieces of their flesh and bodies, even though they're not even adults yet. So, where's consent there? They're blurring the lines of consent. So this is like the slippery slope, if you like, for justifying pedophilia. Now, I'm not saying this to agitate anyone. I'm saying, well, this is the logical consequence. You just got to be, why is that desire wrong? But this other desire you should identify with, because based on your own framework, you're blurring the lines now. Which leads interesting to the final assumption, which is based on um, uh, essentially queer theory and gender theory. And what this is, that they basically say that, everything is, same-sex attraction, gender fluidity is a social construct. There is no fixed essence. Now, what this basically is, in a nutshell, it can get philosophically complicated, but basically, this is the kind of the T and the Q part of the LGBTQ plus, and they have this kind of understanding of queer theory, and queer theory, in a way, is like a modern application of old postmodern principles. Now, generally, postmodern principles, there's a few of them, but one of them includes radical skepticism, that they would say that there is no uh, objective method to obtain objective truths about reality. Um, so from that perspective, they say, even, and that includes science, right? We're radically skeptical about biology and therefore about gender, because it's just a social construction, because it's just um, perpetuated in language. Yeah. So biological truths and truths about gender are just a form of socialization, right? So they had this kind of radical skepticism going on. Also, the postmodern idea about social hierarchies, and this comes from Foucault, for example, that society is based on hierarchies, and those hierarchies have power, and power is not like something pressing down upon you; it's a grid, right? And where you find these hierarchies, there are powerful people that they decide what knowledge can be obtained. They tell you what is true and false, right? They tell you what is right and wrong. And so what they say is this is a form of oppression. This is inherently unjust. So what a lot of queer theorists even argue sometimes, they say, well, we need to dismantle these hierarchies, yeah? And also with the idea of radical skepticism, they're saying, well, there's no method to obtain truth about a particular reality, um, because they say, it's all a social construct. And one reason they say it's a social construct as well is because of language, and they follow this Derridian or Derrida. He had this argument that language doesn't represent reality. Language, makes up reality. Yeah.
Mm,
And
mm,
he had this idea that language is relational, and inherently phallogocentric or male centric. So you would say, what is the opposite of a male? It's a female, right? So you don't say what's the opposite of a female, it's a male. And naturally you say, you start with the man, if you like, and it's relational, and that shapes your understanding of the world. So if you change your language, you change the world, change your understanding of the world. And this leads to kind of queer theory. So take, for example, the works of Judith Butler. She had this idea of gender performativity. And she basically argues that, look, you have your own power. Forget the hierarchies in society, dismantle them because they're inherently unjust. Yeah. Because we mentioned that before, right? Postmodernists, generally speaking, said, that you have hierarchies, and in those hierarchies, you have people who could tell you what is true and what is not true. They have power, so they control truth. And therefore there is no truth, or we can make up our own truth if we have our own power. Yeah. And that's why I like to agitate the hierarchy and dismantle any power structure, because they know we should take control. So gender performativity, according to Judith Butler, is like you have your own agency. Forget what these hierarchies tell you, forget what society tells you, because it's on hierarchies with certain power, and they tell you what's right and wrong and what can be known and what can't be known, but just reject that completely. So from that perspective, they say no, it's you could have your own agency and power, right? And also they argued about language. Remember the kind of Derridian understanding of language. They say, well, if language makes up your reality, then just make up your own language. And then Judith Butler creates an argument using a husband and wife when they get married. In Western society, you'll have a Christian priest, for example, who has legal authority from the government in some way. So therefore, he's in the hierarchy. He's been given that power, and he uses his language. Because what does he say in the ceremony, right? But what something like, by the power invested in me, I now announce you man and wife. So he has power given from a hierarchy, the government, or legal authority, and he uses language to now change the identity from single people to actually married people. It's actually a smart argument that she made. Um, but it's dumb because it's disanalogous. I get what she was trying to do, but it's disanalogous, right? Why is it disanalogous? Because the yes, he's using his power and language, but he's not using his power and language to actually change anything about their objective reality. But what gender fluidity does, it uses power and language to actually change uh, objective reality, right? And I give you an example, because gender fluidity says that irrespective, remember the radical skepticism of the postmodernists, irrespective of any biological markers, because they're not biological essentialists. In actual fact, no academic is a biological essentialist. Most are moderate. They adopt a moderate position where it's a combination of social construct or society and biology. But what they do, they're radical skeptics. They reject all biology. So
mm,
therefore, any biological physical marker is irrelevant to your gender identity. So I can say, according to Judith Butler, according to some conceptions of queer theory, I can say I'm a black lesbian.
Yeah.
I don't look black, right? And I'm still attracted to women, right? Because I'm a man, but I could say I'm a lesbian. I say I'm a female. That's a lesbian, and I don't
Yeah.
change my behavior, and I don't change any of my physical markers. Do you understand? So
Yeah.
therefore, it reduces queer theory to utmost nonsense, and that's why sometimes you hear in popular culture. I think what's his name? That popular podcaster. He basically said, "Well, I could say I'm a twin spirit penguin." Well, you can because he's using his own agency power and his own language. So
Yeah.
her using the priest analogy was smart, but it wasn't smart enough
Yeah.
because he's not using any agency or language to actually go against objective, independent facts, right?
It's crazy how Judith Butler uses the word performative. She uses the words performative to describe a natural tendency for since time began of how male and female react, right? She calls that performative, whereas she doesn't call um, people making up identities and being something that they aren't it's crazy when you read her work as to
Yeah,
what
but in fairness to
how
her,
she
she
uses
doesn't
that
use
word.
performative as acting out. She uses the
Mhm.
word performative as if you
People
had
use these words to have these performative functions,
yes, yes.
and if you change the language and you change everything, but it's a bit like saying, okay, if I say this is a pearl and somebody says it's not a pearl, it doesn't stop that thing becoming a pearl just because somebody else has said that's not a pearl, for
Yeah,
example,
well,
right?
yeah, so we have our own view in the Islamic tradition, we believe in hierarchies. For example, when Allah says in chapter 4, verse 34, that men have, qawam, this kind of
Mm,
hierarchical authority because, you know, of the position that Allah has placed them in for various reasons. Also, so we do believe in hierarchies and we believe in powers in those hierarchies. Yes, they could be misused and some people could be unjust, but that's not because of the Islamic teachings, because of deviation of the Islamic teachings. Yeah. Also, what about language? We believe actually language, um, uh,
is important.
it doesn't make up reality. It
Mm,
represents reality in a way.
mm,
Because what does Allah say? Allah taught Adam the names of things, right?
mm,
So and what's very interesting, if you look at the tafsir here, the classical commentators, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically saying to us that Allah taught Adam the names of things, referring to inspiring Adam alayhi salam, the first human, to of knowledge of what the essence of things, their properties,
mm,
their names, and the foundations of the branches of knowledge. So it's not that you just make up language to change reality. No, this language is representing the essence of things, the
that's that.
things, the foundations of the branches of knowledge. And this is known in the classical exegesis. So we believe in a hierarchy, and we believe that language is not a Derridian understanding. It's actually it's not just relational and phalangocentric, and you can make it up and you could change your reality. No, it actually represents reality. And that's why our view will go against the queer theory perspective or the trans perspective, because we don't adopt that false assumption. Now, you know, what you usually hear from the LGBTQ plus community, they would mention two main things, I think, as contentions to this kind of unpacking of the assumptions. They'll be like, okay, well, if we have assumptions and you got assumptions, then don't force our assumptions on us. Well, this is exactly where we want you. Leave us alone. Just leave us alone. Stop
Yes.
legislating, stop legislating the whole thing. If you admit that's the case, then leave us alone. If you feel you don't have any epistemic or moral obligation to accept our assumptions, well, we don't have an epistemic or moral obligation to accept yours either. And that's
Lakum
why,
dinakum waliyadin.
yeah, and that's why they hardly have philosophical debates on this issue, by the way. Because
Mm,
when you study the queer theorists, especially, they admit because they don't believe in any objective truth and they don't believe they could even come to an objective truth, they always want to be in a process of dismantling the hierarchies and also changing language. And that's what they always want to do, right? Because they know that they think it's inherently unjust and they think it's inherently disempowering and whatever, the reasons that we mentioned. But the point is, that's what they want to do. So that's why to get them into a philosophical conversation, they won't accept it because they don't believe in any objective truth, generally speaking, especially the ones that have adopted the kind of older postmodern principles or assumptions. So it's very hard to even debate these issues with them. Yeah, you'd be going
Mm,
around in circles. And that's why, and if you do, you could put them into these corners, but they don't like it because, in my view, and I don't want to, reduce it to this, but I just really believe they just worship their desires. They are ahl al hawa. They are people of hawa, and it's not a philosophical argument. They have created a philosophy, created principles, created this madness, intellectual madness, just to justify their own desires.
mhm,
It really is. You could reduce it to the verse in the Quran. Have you not seen the one who takes his own desires as his Lord? So they would say, don't force these assumptions upon us. The other thing we would say in response to this is, yeah, fine, we may have our own principles and assumptions, but we could prove ours. We could show you where they've come from. And obviously, in the Islamic intellectual tradition, we don't have time to explain this now, but we believe in Allah and we've got good reasons why Allah exists. We believe in the Quran, we have good reasons why the Quran is true. We believe in the Prophet, and we have good rational reasons why, sound rational reasons why the Prophet is the final prophet. Khalas. But they don't have that intellectual basis and foundation. It's just kind of made up, right? Um, Also, they would say, well, this whole nonsense rhetorical trap, love is love, right?
mm,
Uh, which, sometimes intuitively might sting at first. You don't know how to deal with it, but well, water is water when you drink from the toilet bowl, or sex is sex when you make love to a corpse, or food is food when you eat vomit or eat a dead person. What they're trying to say is that there should be no external revelation that should
mm.
take the way I express my love. But
No
you have,
boundaries, like what you said at the
but they
start.
have their boundaries.
Mhm.
They may be less than ours or whatever, but then we would argue, well, who draws the line and where? And we would also say, well, what is love? Is love just expressing a desire? No, love is intentional and directional. Love is being committed to the goodness and guidance of all people, right? Love is standing for someone. It's not a passive effect, it's active. You want goodness and guidance for them. And if that is love, then what is goodness and then what is guidance? We just refer it back to Allah, right? But they don't have
Mm,
the understanding. For them, what is love is follow your desire. We're saying love is follow Allah, who is Al-Wadud, the most loving and the
mm,
source of love. It's a difference, right? So it's a nonsense rhetorical trap that they come up with sometimes. And really, you don't truly love someone if you love their made up sexual identity that goes against their fitrah, that defies Allah's commands. In fact, you're oppressing them. It's a big difference. If you truly love them, you want goodness and guidance for them.
mm.
Okay?
That's
Well,
right.
what is that goodness and what is that guidance? And that's the discussion we want to have with them. We don't want to go into courts of law or debate school policy or go into these nuances. Let's go to the fundamentals. Allah is a reality and he should be obeyed. If they were to accept that, it would shape their worldview. Because what worldviews are like lenses you put on your eyes in order to understand the world. If your lenses are green, all you're going to see is green. But our lenses are not cracked like their lenses. Our lenses are clear. They give us clarity. It makes us understand ourselves and reality. Their lenses are cracked, and we just have to give them our lenses. And the way to do that is not even discussing these assumptions sometimes, it's going straight to the foundations. This is what we believe. This is Allah. This is the Quran. This is the Prophet. We could prove these things to be true. Allow these to be your lenses. You could see it clearly now. And you're able to deal with your blameworthy or your praiseworthy desires, wherever they are. Allah has that framework for us. So these are the kind of key assumptions. There may be more, and these are some ways. These are some of the reasons why Islam disagrees with them, and these are
Mhm.
some why they're incoherent.
I think
Um,
what you said there is so powerful, where you're saying, look, we don't disagree with the reality of what you're facing, or that there are these attractions and you have it and you're compelled to it. We're not disagreeing with it, but we're asking you to look at it differently, to
Yes,
have a
the
different narrative.
cognitive and spiritual reframing is so important. And this is why I know I'm coming across as passionate, but I do believe people with same-sex attraction, and just like what the discussion we had in the podcast, I really believe this. And it was echoed in the comments as well. And they've dealt with it in an Islamic way by cognitively and spiritually framing it properly. These people are the truest, some of the best human beings, especially when it comes to masculinity. If you're a man and you've dealt with it, you're a true man. You're more of a man than most men, because a real man deals with his desires. A real human being deals with the lowly desires, accepts them, fine, this is my test. It's a struggle. I might fall, but I know what's right. I know what lens to use, the clear lens, which is Islam, the Quran, Sunnah, the scholars. I'm going to use that to navigate the space to elevate myself. Um, but I'm not going to identify with these desires. And it's just like even dealing with, in taskiyat nafs, in tasawwuf, in purification of the heart. When you have a feeling of hasad, jealousy, or envy, uh, what they teach is that you don't identify with that lowly uh, disease of the soul. The problem is people act as jealous people, and it's a slippery slope to destruction because they now have identified with the lowly aspect of themselves. But what they're taught is to actually make a distinction. Allah wants you to be here. There's a profound calling for you. There's a profound it's a test for you, but that test is elevating you. It's a sign of Allah's love as well. And Allah wants you to worship Him and serve Him, not to serve your desires. And you are not that desire. Yeah, it's come from your lowly self or from shaitan, but you're bigger than that. Having that in place allows you to not identify completely with that desire now. Because, even me, when I'm, in the spheres that we're in, sometimes I may be angry, or I might have a bit of ujub, self-amazement, or arrogance. And then I notice it and I'm like, okay, that's not me. That's not who I want to be. My vision for myself is the vision Allah has given me, to be a believer, to go to Jannah, to worship Him, to elevate myself, to be someone who's submitting to Him, to something higher. That's not what I'm identifying with. I'm identifying with what Allah wants me to identify with. So therefore, already I'm not attached to that dark cloud. If you're attached to it, it's going to start raining, and you're going to drown yourself in sin and confusion and existential angst, right? But so there, I'm not attaching myself. It's still there. It might be painful, but now I'm going to act and follow the correct strategy, if you like, from the Quran and the Sunnah, and what our scholars have taught us to actually deal with that blameworthy desire or feeling. And then you just got to keep on acting. And then the more you act, the more you change as well. It's like fake it till you make it sometimes. And it actually works, especially if you have the right intention. Yeah. It won't work all the time, but at least you're on that path. Being on the path is the whole point. Sometimes there won't be no end. This is a struggle. Life is a struggle. Life is a test. The Sahaba, they would always assume that tests were coming. They never thought it was always going to be happy. They were worried when there were no tests, because the default position is that you're going to be tested, and you're going to be tested with blessing, right? That's a test too, and you're going to be tested with suffering. But the believer is on that path of dealing with those tests in a way that's pleasing to Allah. And that is the struggle of life. That's the jihad of the human being, the everyday human being. Some people they're tested with the sexual desire. Other people are tested with money, with fame, with power, with ego, with arrogance, with hasad, with blameworthy jealousy, with family. It could be a whole combination of things. But the whole point is that you traverse the path and you try your best. And if you're traversing that path, you're trying your best, then you are one of the chosen ones, and you're going to be in eternal bliss in paradise at the end of the day. This life is short. The famous hadith, the person who has suffered a whole lifetime and were destined for Jannah, they will be dipped in paradise for a split moment, and they'll be asked, did you ever suffer? And he will say, Wallahi, I've never suffered. So it's the greatest equalizer, the akhirah. Everything's going to be fine. And that's like people with same-sex attraction that are dealing with it. They're on that path of that struggle and dealing with it and elevating themselves and getting all the tools from the tradition to actually deal with that, and have the most flourishing lives that they can live. These people are our spiritual heroes, because these are big tests to deal with. And that's why I mentioned when I spoke to you in the podcast, I was like, you're more of a man than many men that I know, to be honest. So, and
Oh
I
no,
believe that. I really believe that,
thank you. Yeah,
I think I was speaking to my wife about this as well, and she had a lot of admiration. She's like, "This subhanallah, you know, this is
thank
a
you.
true true rujula, true masculinity. Because true
And I,
masculinity is actually dealing with your nafs and your
I
desires."
And I throw that out to all the viewers and people who are watching this and who are doing this work silently. I know I'm usually in the limelight, but I know so many of us which are doing this kind of work by themselves, and may Allah bless them. And
Mm.
whatever Brother Hamza said to me applies to them as well in their struggle. I know of time, and I know that you have to go. I'm just gonna maybe uh, let's see 5 minutes. Let's just see.
Absolutely. No
Is that
questions.
okay?
Absolutely. Yeah, of course.
Um, okay, let's. So there's a question about the podcast. You can go. I can send that, but if you go to Islam 21C, you'll be able to see that, inshallah. Um, there's a question here. I was wondering whether you have any advice to someone who tried marriage as a way to deal with SSA and failed miserably. How do we move on in life without feeling stuck and deficient? I think this is a great question. To sometimes people think that if I get married, then the attraction goes away. And that actually the work, what we are talking about, is tazkiyat al-nafs, or improving the soul, which is you know sometimes, and we talk about it on the podcast, that a lot of people said haza banati athar lakum. It doesn't mean get married. It means when you do a sexual relation, when you get to do a sexual relation, the only halal sexual relation is marriage, but it doesn't mean that it's secure for same-sex attraction. Go ahead, Ustadh, if you have
Yeah,
any.
I don't have much. This is not my area. So, I mean, I do have my own kind of uh, maybe an insight, but I don't know. I'm just scared to not offend, but I'm scared to say the wrong thing because you know. I have a question for you. Yeah.
Yes.
So, you know, and this happened. So one brother was speaking to another brother, big bearded brother. He had same-sex attraction. Yeah, I think he even called himself a homosexual. He said, "Look, okay, you got same-sex attraction." So the other brother was responding to him and saying, "Look, what is it of the man that you're attracted to?" Now I know for many people it's different. It's psychological. It's so many different things. I appreciate that. And you explained some of that in the podcast. But are there some people with same-sex attraction who are not necessarily attracted to the gender, the same sex gender, they're attracted to certain features that are correlated to the gender. So
Yes.
in that conversation, he convinced him and said, "Why don't you go for women who look, inverted commas, from a Western perspective, more masculine, or like bodybuilders that are women?"
Yes.
He actually said, "You know what? And this is what he said. Apparently, he said, I agree." And then he
Yeah.
just all of a sudden realized it's not necessarily that it was another man because he didn't have the kind of psychological issue where he needed that male touch. For him, it was literally just the physicality of a man. And he said, if I could find that
Yes.
in a woman, then khalas, I'll be with the woman. Yeah, as
100%.
we
We
say
all.
in the UK, horses for courses, whatever floats your boat, right? But it's
Yes.
true. Like, look, I give an example, and this is a phenomenon because even amongst the Sahaba, like the Sahaba today would probably not be attracted to a Western woman because the Sahaba, generally speaking, I'm not saying for all, but based on a particular hadith about that servant boy, they liked big women, right? And I think the servant boy said something like,
Mm.
she has 3 rows in the front and 2 rows in the back. Yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
big woman. Now, for a lot of Western people, that's not their thing, but for some of the Arabs, that's their thing. Well, khalas.
Mm.
So is there elements of same-sex attraction that is not just psychologically related based on the gender because of maybe fatherhood, detachment, or whatever the case may be, but it's about the specific features? Have you seen that in your mentoring?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There is no one way of experiencing same-sex attraction. Some people are attracted physically. A lot of males, the understanding is, oh, it's males are very physical and they understand. But a lot of them are attracted emotionally. They might be attracted to a, a, a confidence. It might not even be a physical thing. So the attraction can be very, very varied. And that's why I said the identity concept is so bad that just because I'm attracted to something about a man, suddenly I'm belonging to this category where it's saying, well, no, people who don't have same-sex attraction can also say, "Oh, this man is courageous. He's handsome. He's, whatever." Uh, it's just that that hasn't become sexualized, and just because that attraction has become sexualized doesn't mean I'm inherently a different human being.
Hmm.
And people might see my story and say, yeah, that's how Ali experiences same-sex attraction, but I experience same-sex attraction in a different way, and that's completely normal because even with opposite sex attraction, the type of women that Ustadh is attracted to may not be the type of women I'm attracted to because there's a difference in
Yes.
attraction, right? And sometimes when we frame it as an identity model, then we think everybody is attracted to the same thing, whereas that's a fantastic example with how the Arabs view attraction, how
Yeah,
then
and you
and
know
how
what?
we order it now.
Yeah, and what's important to say, I wanted to mention this actually, maybe we could say this as a last point. 'Cause I have to visit the gents as well. I had too much coffee. So basically, what happened is what we need. Like, I had a situation where I spoke to someone years ago. This is before I was even like had any kind of maybe a little bit of a deeper understanding of the tradition. He had same-sex attraction, and he was actually practicing it. And I would sit in a car with him for many times, have long meetings and trying to coach him out of it. And we explored his relation with his father, this, that, and the other. But for him, the very fact that I gave him space, the very fact that I gave him that compassion that, we can deal with this, we could solve this. The very fact that I didn't judge him. You know what? He's married, kids, I think. Happy guy now. I found
Alhamdulillah.
out after. And now that could be that all he needed was a dominant, I'm not saying I'm dominant, but maybe a confident
No, no,
male saying, look,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
like, I got you, man.
Yeah.
I
I'm
think you're
here
better.
for you.
I think you're better than me. I'm humble towards you, even though you may be falling into sin here and there, but I fall into sin as well. Kibr, arrogance is a crazy sin. An atom's weight
Mm.
of kibr, you won't go, and as mustard seed of kibr, you won't go to paradise. Fine, you got this, do tawbah. Let's work on this, right? And what the reason I'm saying this is because we don't have that on the correct level yet in our community. It's still a
Mm.
taboo. We still don't give people space. We don't look at the Prophet ﷺ. The young man came to Prophet ﷺ and said, "Allow me to commit zina." Then the Sahaba were like, "Quiet, quiet." But the Prophet said, "Come, sit down." And then he engaged with him in a psychological way. He didn't say, "Don't you know it's haram?" Because you can't give an abstract theological rule to a young man who's got desires. The person psychologicalized it. He said, "What about your mother, your auntie, and so on and so forth?" Then he put his hand on his heart. The person put his hand on the young man's heart and made dua for him. Touch, care, space, emotional intelligence. Wallahi, we miss this, man. We don't have this in our communities, right? And we need this. Imagine there could be thousands of people in our community with these struggles, and they're on their own. I mean, that is terrifying.
And what you just did there, holding space to a believer, we can do that for so many things, right? For same-sex attraction, for suicide, for any other mental
Absolutely.
health issue which is out there. And I think that's the core of Islam. And that's what you started with when you talked about the universality of Islam,
Mhm.
when it treats every human being with respect. And just the sitting down with someone and saying, no, you've got it, brother. You're better than me. May Allah bless you. I couldn't even do what you're doing. I think those words of wisdom, especially coming from you know, people like you, people of authority, people who have is huge, and I'm glad to see you do it. I bless you. May Allah bless you. And I know you've got a fantastic talk on the far right and dawah and how we give
Yeah.
that. So I pray that goes well for you, inshallah.
Allah bless you.
Thank you so much for your time, Ustadhana. And we continue to, may Allah bless the work you're doing with Sapience Institute, the
Amen.
fantastic initiative with Lighthouse Mentoring, which I thought was absolutely amazing as well. To the audience, if I have not answered your questions, please email. We have email contact@strongsupport.co.uk. So if there was something there that we couldn't address, please do reach out. And I pray for the success of Brother Hamza. I can honestly, sincerely say, as you probably witnessed in the webinar, he's a fantastic individual. There's so much for the community. It was a blessing to see him face to face when we did at the podcast, and I'm sure we'll continue to benefit from him in the future. Thank you so much, Ustadhana.
May Allah bless you.
And
Sorry, I'm trying to multitask. Yeah, may Allah bless you. Jazakallah. I need to go to the downstairs because it's actually in Leicester, the conference, and I'm in
Oh,
one of
it's
the
in
boardrooms.
Leicester.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
yes,
So I had a session earlier, and this is the in between, and now I'm going to do the last session. And yeah, looking forward to it. Jazakallah for the time. And you know what? Offline, let's communicate. I know I'm very bad at WhatsApp and communication. It's always on do not disturb because so many people have access to my phone. If I had it, you know, always on notifications, I'll be a wreck right now, or more of a wreck anyway. So it would be really good because it'd be good to like articulate some of these ideas in writing, even
absolutely,
for you to train our mentors on how to deal with this. Because our
absolutely.
mentors on these particular issues are actually not trained on the same sex attraction stuff. So let's work together, man.
Absolutely.
Here, bro.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Ustad.
Take care.
Thank you.
And salam everyone as well. I hope you enjoyed it.